Today is Monday, October 3rd, and you're listening to the Beer Temple Podcast.
Remember this is what we wanted. Remember this is what we said. To never be heard or seen from again. Remember this is what we wanted. Remember this is what we said. To never be heard or seen from again.
Hello and welcome to the Beer Temple Podcast. I am your co-host, Mike Siegel, and I'm here with my co-host and honorary Fade Master for the day, Chris Quinn. Chris, how you doing?
I'm sure people already know that Serge is not here, just based on the original Fade. And also, we're doing the classic, like, 80s hair band, like, standing back-to-back, going into the same mic. That's essentially what we're doing right now. We're sharing a mic.
Yeah, if they could see what was going on, they would know Serge wasn't here because we couldn't get the USB mic to work. So,
yeah,
a little behind base, inside base.
Yeah, so we're in the Fox room. We're not in Studio BT, and it's a Monday, as you may have picked up on, based on the intro. So we've got a little bit of a special episode. But before we get into that, I do want to thank everyone who listens. Thanks for tuning in via 105.5 FM Lumpen Radio. Thank you to everybody down at Lumpen for having us on. Or, if you're like the majority of us, you probably downloaded it via wherever you download your podcasts from, and thank you for that as well. And, I think this is episode, 261, I believe. So it's been getting up there, believe it or not. And we have... we have a pretty special episode. We've got some guests from overseas, but actually in-house. And we're going to talk about, a pretty special series of beers, but the latest in a series. And for those of you who've listened to the show in the past, you'll have heard of some of these beers before. I'm not really doing a very smooth intro to this, but it'll get smoother as we go on. I'm also craned over and leaning into my microphone. All right, I'll just pull it closer. I'll just relax. So our guests will be introducing themselves in a moment, but we do have a recurring guest, friend of the show, Mike Siegel of Goose Island. How are you, man? Good to see you.
Great to be back, as always.
Yeah. What's new with you? What brings you in today? Just wanted to come in and have a beer, and podcast happened to be going.
I brought some friends. So, we, pardon me, a beer a few years in the making, at the very least. I'd say 2.5 to 3 years in the making, is the third in an unintentional series of beers that started back in 2016. This beer is called Black Eagle. It's a historical recreation of a 1960 English barley wine, and we'll get into all the details there. But I wanted to tee up our two guests here. So the collaborator that we've done 3 out of 3 with is beer historian, author, and beer writer Ron Pattinson. I'm going to let him offer up his bio in a short paragraph here.
Honor to have you on, by the way, Ron.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm a beer historian. I've been fairly obsessively researching British beer for about 20 years now, going back to original sources and trying to dispel some of the many myths relating to beer history. Has been my role in life, at which I've been partially successful. I have a blog called Shut Up About Barclay Perkins, the title of which normally confuses the hell out of people. And I've written and published 40-something books. I can't remember exactly how many. I sort of lose count after the first dozen or so. And I continue to keep writing about mostly British beer, but occasionally German or Dutch beer as well.
And we did our first beer with Ron was in 2016, Brewery Yard Stock Pale Ale, a Truman's recipe, a brewery we're going to talk about, I think, in depth here very shortly. That was an 1877 Stock Pale Ale. Historical recreation, meaning we're using the original recipe, trying to be faithful to it, both in ingredients and in process as much as possible, but trying to create a beer that tastes as close as we can possibly create to that beer of that period. The second beer that we did was Obadiah Poundage, and with that beer we brought in a brewing legend from London, a gentleman who's, I'll let him give his short bio, but for me, he's a brewing legend. He's been brewing in London for 52 years, Derek Prentice.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks very much, Chris and Mike, for having me on the show. I started in the brewing industry quite some years ago, as Mike has said. I originally started with the Truman Brewery, and at that time the Truman Brewery was a big old rambling Victorian brewery stuck right in the heart of London. I started in a laboratory, not intending to go into the brewing industry, but within probably 6 weeks I knew that this would probably be where I was going to finish up, and sure enough, that's what's happened. So I've been brewing I was at Truman's for 20 years. I had the great fortune to then move to another lovely old brewery, regional brewery called Young's Brewery in southwest London, and finished up a sort of working career, an active working career, if you like, at Fuller's. Subsequently, I got involved. It's very difficult if you're a brewer to completely fall out of it. So I just sort of got involved in starting up a small craft brewery in Wimbledon.
Okay. What's the name of that brewery?
That's Wimbledon Brewery.
Oh, Wimbledon Brewery.
It's called
Okay.
Wimbledon Brewery.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Hopefully one of these days we'll get one of our beers on your shelf.
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah,
nice.
that'd be great.
And in these on both Obadiah Poundage and Black Eagle, it's we call out Ron, of course, as a beer historian, but also Wimbledon Brewery. So not Derek by name, but essentially is working directly with Derek on these.
And Derek, it's an honor to have you here as well. Thanks so much. I've heard a lot about you from Mike over the years. So, it's a name that just keeps popping up when Mike and I geek out about historical English styles of beer. Your name seems to keep coming up, and obviously, Ron, yours as well. So exciting to have you guys in the room. And the reason that you guys are all here is for this beer, right, Mike? That Mike Siegel, I guess, which is called Black Eagle No. 1 Barley Wine. Is that the name of it? Or
Yeah,
you tell me. I guess.
Yeah.
It's your
And
beer.
I'll do a little show and tell here. This is horrible for a podcast, but I'm holding up a Truman's, and I'll
verify he is actually
It's
holding it up.
It's an old. I eBayed some old Truman's coasters, and on it says No. 1 Burton barley wine. And so Ron and Derek will get into what kind of number 1 is and what the numbering system was relative to the period of time. But you can see that was the influence for the label. Again, horrible for a podcast I'm showing you guys,
No,
but
we'll get
people
it.
will be able to look up the images. So just starting with the label is referencing the Truman's Brewery. The name Black Eagle, Derek, what is Black Eagle? Give us a name or give us some context what Black Eagle was.
Yeah, well, like a lot of breweries of the time, they all picked on a logo and, if you like, a brand image. And the Truman Brewery in London was in Grey Eagle Street, so it's the Grey Eagle Brewery. And when they took over a brewery in Burton, they built a brewery in Burton, they called it the Black Eagle Brewery. So it was the Black Eagle Brewery. In fact, the Black Eagle was the sign of Truman's, and there's still a Black Eagle sign outside the brewery buildings in Brick Lane to this day.
Yeah, a lot of the brewery site is still there.
Yeah.
The actual like exteriors, at least. The
Some
old brick
parts,
building.
and some
Yeah.
of the older buildings are still there. A lot of the site was redeveloped, but you can still see what was the site of the original Truman Brewery, which dates back to the 17th century.
So it's not that there's some sort of old antiquated law saying that one out of every so many breweries or taverns needs to be a named after an animal and then some sort of descriptor as well, like the red lion, the white horse, the black eagle, the lazy dog, the something like that. Because I assumed it was something. I mean, you couldn't get a more British name, frankly, than the Black Eagle. But
Well,
I do like
job,
it.
yeah.
Good. Was something you wanted to say? An actual question, Mike?
No, there is a Black Eagle like football pub north of here. I wonder if they're true inspiration from that.
Yeah.
So getting back to what the beer is, we call it, and I'm reading off the label here, again, Goose Island, Wimbledon, collaboration, also in collaboration with Ron Pattinson, of course, and we always like to give Ron some front label credit there for all the work that he does. And a lot of this is the manifestation of a friendship and a partnership with Ron on these beers, but also calling out what he does and the service he provides the greater brewing industry of beer history, like really primary source beer history, not just something that somebody passed down to something in oral history, but really primary source. So this is a barley wine circa, it's 2 recipes, and we'll get into some of the details of why that is. But it's 2 Truman's recipes from 1960 blended together. And the reason why we landed on doing a barley wine of this period is because Derek worked at Truman's in the late 1960s and remembers some of the kind of the last days of making barley wine this way, meaning like aging in wood and blending with fresh beer. So, Derek, you recall some of the you had said earlier, some of the kind of the last days of making barley wine this way in Burton in London.
Yep, that's right, Mike. Although I never worked in Burton, and up until the Burton Brewery closed in the early 70s, all the production was done up in Burton. But just at the end of at the time when the Burton Brewery was closing, before we redeveloped the London Brewery site, they shipped down some of the stock ale, which is part of the barley wine process, and we then brewed a running beer to go with it and blended it to go into bottling.
Got it. So then the beer is a barley wine, as the name suggests, but it is kind of a historic recreation of what barley wine was in the not too distant past, but also something that is more or less mostly or entirely in the past. At this point.
Just not how people think of barley wine
Right.
these days. I think most of us here in the States would think of barley wine usually in the American sense, like a Bigfoot or a bourbon barrel-aged barley wine, which we're all familiar with. A lot of breweries doing those, including Goose Island. Bigger beers, more robust. This is 8.6% ABV, so still quite high, not sessionable, but a couple of notches down than what a lot of American barley wines or certainly barrel-aged barley wines would be.
Double digit, yeah.
So this was, and I've got the recipes here, but essentially it was a stock beer. So a beer, and I don't want to just throw that term around without providing some context. Actually, Ron, a synopsis of stock ale.
Stock ale. So they were beers which were deliberately brewed to be aged, which would often mean that they'd be more heavily hopped. For a full 100% stock ale, they'd be aged for at least 12 months. Depending on the style, it would vary where you would actually age them. But for barley wines, it was mostly done in what you call trade casks. So they're casks which would be sent to the pub, or in hogsheads, which are still relatively small casks, only 44 imperial gallons. And yeah, they just leave them in the wood for a while, let Brettanomyces work its magic, which they would have picked up from who knows where.
Right, just from being there, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for the most of the time when they made stock ales, they had no idea how the secondary conditioning worked.
So this is a fairly modern take on it, but the style is quite a bit older. Ron, I mean, since we have you here, Ron, I mean, and Derek as well, if you feel comfortable chiming in, I mean, could you talk about the origins of some of these big English styles? Because I know that there's the terms like barley wine, old ale, stock ale, Burton ale, and man, that stuff really becomes confusing. It's all just strong English beer. So how we're going to test your skill. How quickly can you kind of give us a rundown of the past, I don't know, 500 years of strong English beer? Can you do it in like one sentence? No, I'm joking. But no, I do think it would be interesting to hear maybe the origins of this type of strong English beer.
Well, right. When you look at barley wines, start with the term barley wine. First reference I've got to it is 1870, specifically referring to Bass No. 1. So Bass being the largest of the Burton brewers. But it goes back further. Everyone associates Burton nowadays with pale ale. But originally, the sort of beers that they brewed in Burton were strong dark ales. And they continued to brew those, even while all through the pale ale period, they still brewed these strong Burton ales. And it varied from brewery to brewery, but the system that a lot of them used, such as Truman's and Bass, was that they numbered them. So they'd start off at number 1, which was the strongest, and go down to number 8. And usually 6 to 8 were mild ales. Then you've got old ales, and at the top you've got the strong ales. So number 1 and number 2 were counted as strong ales. And at a certain point, Bass started calling their number 1 barley wine. Not quite sure why. There's not much of a story behind it. I just found, at first people thought it was only in the 1890s, and then I found an older reference from around 1870, I think it was. And so Truman's being another Burton brewery, they were direct competitors of Bass. And this is obviously, their number 1 barley wine is obviously meant to be a competitor to the Bass beer. Mm-hmm. When you go back to before World War I, these beers were generally over 1,100 original gravity, so probably 10.5%, 11% ABV. So pretty powerful beers for the time. And yeah, they'd have always been brewed as stock ales. And that went on obviously until the 1960s. I don't know when Bass stopped doing it as a stock ale, probably either in the 50s or 60s. I'm not quite sure exactly when. I mean, I can remember Bass No. 1. I actually had it a couple of times.
Wow. So it's not ancient history then? No,
I don't know when Bass discontinued it. I think probably in the 70s sometime.
Okay.
I mean, I drank it in probably 73, 74, something like that. Yeah, in Mablethorpe of all places. But anyway, yeah, so that's basically a synopsis of the strong Burton ales.
Okay, and then so the term Burton ale, because I see, we talk whenever, well, again, Mike and I, if we're talking about old English styles, your name comes up, and Martin Cornell's name comes up as well. And Mike, you provided some excerpts from Amber. It's Amber Golden Black. Yes. Great book. I was running around looking for it. It's at my house right now.
No, I have your copy.
Oh, you have it. I was like, where is it? And one thing that I found interesting is that Burton Ale, at least at one point in time, did not really define the style. It really defined, I guess, the locale, which makes sense, but it sounded like Burton Ale could be an old ale, a mild, a barley wine, et cetera, et cetera. Is that?
Yeah, it could be any style that was brewed in Burton.
Okay.
So they'd also call it a Burton Pale Ale.
Got it. Okay.
But just to confuse matters.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's confusing. And the more I hear about it, the more it's kind of like there isn't a definitive lineage. It seems like it all was kind of mushed together and then maybe separated out and then got mushed together again.
Well, that's what all beer history's like. It's all really complicated.
Yeah.
But the complication I was going to say is that in London, they brewed stock ales and had done for the big London breweries since the 1830s. And these were normally designated by a number of Ks, so 2K to 4K, including the one that I can never get anyone to brew in the States, which is KKK, which is a very unfortunate name.
No, I don't think that. Yeah.
So, but what these stock ales were called, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they started calling them Burton Ale, even though they were brewed in London. And so Burton Ale was one of the standard beers in a London pub from the 1880s up until about 1960. And there's only one Burton Ale left, which is a beer which Derek brewed. which was Young's Winter Warmer, which is the last of the London Burton ales.
And to confuse things even more, it sounds like for a while, Old Ale and Burton Ale were the same style of beer.
Well,
No?
we were talking about this earlier, and I was saying, well, trying to draw a line between Old Ale and Burton and barley wine is incredibly difficult, because to some extent it's pretty random, and it just depends on what the brewery decides to call it. The only things that are hard and fast is that an Old Ale is always going to be dark, whereas a barley wine can be either pale or dark.
Got it.
And a barley wine isn't really ever going to be under about 7.5% ABV, whereas beers called Old Ale can be as weak as 4.5%.
Okay. Well, I'm about as confused as I was when we started, which is what I was expecting, frankly. But
Sounds like time to taste.
I think we probably should. And in the meantime, while we're setting it up, so there's been reference to Truman's. I've obviously never had anything from Truman's, but I know that at least one of the other the Brewery Yard beer, the first beer in the Unintentional series, was also a Truman's recipe.
Yeah,
Is that
all
right?
three are Truman's.
All three are Truman's recipes.
Yeah, unintentional series of historical beers and unintentional series of Truman's recipes, but it's all lined up that way. And again, Derek came on with the second one, Obadiah Poundage, and that's kind of what got me thinking about this third one as a more of a personal story. There's about a decade between his time in brewing and this recipe, but very much in the same era, the 1960s. So, again, going back to what this beer is, it's a slightly higher hop, two recipes. One, the stock beer, a little bit higher hopping, more bitterness.
Okay.
Aged in neutral oak, so we got some oak cask, basically like a toasted wine cask, but we steamed and rinsed the barrels heavily to really neutralize the oak. We don't want, historically speaking, Ron, we don't want to pick up oak, or
No.
British brewers wouldn't have want a flavor of oak.
They hated oak flavour in beers,
Got it.
which is why they virtually never used American oak to make barrels, because they didn't like the fact that it gave too much flavour. About the only beers that they'd put into American oak barrels were porters or stout, where you wouldn't really notice the oak.
Okay. And the Brewery Yard's beer, that was a stock ale, correct? Okay.
100%.
Right.
So Brewery Yard is 100% stock ale, meaning that there's no blending done. What you're tasting is beer aged with Brettanomyces in neutral oak for 11 months.
Right.
Obadiah Poundage, a blend of vatted beers, aka fooder, but the British term vatted beer for 12 months with fresh beer. And then this one back to more of what we would call like a wine cask size, like a 50 or like a 60-gallon cask, 225-liter cask, European oaked, again, to minimize any type of that kind of vanillin, and then steamed and rinsed to neutralize the oak. Aged for 9 months, the stock beer, the barley wine with Brettanomyces clausenii, which we've talked about in the past. All of these have clausenii, and that's that strain of Brettanomyces that was identified at Carlsberg by Clausen, named it after himself, and it was first isolated in British stock beers. So it's the one that I link to doing these types of recreations is Clausenii. Plus, I think it's got a great character to it. It's a great secondary yeast that brings a lot of fruit character.
Sure.
So 9 months on the stock beer, then a fresh beer, the runner or the running beer, as we'll call it. And
Yeah, could you? Well, all right, keep going. We'll get into the running.
yeah, and these guys can get into some of the more specifics, but just the nuts and bolts of what this beer is. Less of a hopping, less hopped on the bitter side. We used invert sugars for both of these, so this used a lighter invert sugar, so like a complex flavored sugar syrup, and then blended 2/3 of the fresh beer to 1/3 of the aged beer. So that's essentially what we're tasting is 1/3 of the beer is that aged component with some fresh beer, with a majority fresh beer blended back.
And so for those of you who have listened to these episodes in the past, you may be you may recognize a theme in British brewing, which is a blending of different ages of beer, which I think now is mostly associated with craft beer lovers in the States as like a Belgian thing. Obviously Lambic being, I think, the most kind of famous, but certainly the Flemish ales and stuff like that. And it seems that the English styles almost went took it a step further with the kind of the Party-Gyle system, where they were actually brewing different strengths of beer. I don't know how would you, Derek? How would you describe the Party-Gyle system of brewing?
It's relatively simple. It's quite difficult to explain over the radio rather than trying to draw it out.
That's why you have a pro here.
It's true, but the principle is that it's quite an efficient way to run what we call a mash tun, or the lauter tun if you're using a lauter tun, but most of the British breweries have mash tuns. To run a mash tun takes quite a long time. So you're waiting probably up to 6 hours for a big mash tun to run off. In the case of Guinness, they would be almost running for 12 hours. And you don't want to be waiting all that time, nor do you want to wait for all the volume to collect. So you would run the first wort to the kettle, which would boil. You add hops and add that. And that would be strong. So that would be your first wort.
Mm-hmm. The first runnings.
The first runnings,
yeah.
Effectively. And that would be your first wort. You'd then be boiling that. That's boiling away. You're continuing to run, and you'll run to a second copper or an underback, but more likely a second copper. And then you'll collect your second copper. And a big mash tun could probably fill 4 coppers, smaller coppers, obviously, than the whole brew length. So you would run your mash tun to a second copper, and that would be a mid-strength type beer.
Because there's less sugars
be
extracted.
Yeah,
right?
You've already had the high-strength sugars off, so this is getting a bit weaker, and you would hop that accordingly and boil that separately. Meanwhile, your first one has turned away, gone into the hop back in the case of British breweries,
mm-hmm.
and is available again. So you may run that again for a third copper. So a simple Party-Gyle could be 2 copper lengths, it could be 3 copper lengths. Bigger ones would be 4 copper lengths, all of different gravities, all with different characteristics. You then take those worts and you blend them into multiple vessels to give you beers of different strengths.
And you blend those
At wort
pre-fermented. Yeah.
Pre-fermentation.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you could make beers of different strengths. And for example,
From one brew day. One brew day would
brew
mean
day.
yes. Yeah.
The British brewers, rather than having what we see nowadays in modern breweries, are relatively small brew houses brewing multiple times during the day to fill probably just one vessel. And you would probably have some of the larger breweries. Most modern breweries are built on the principle of a 24/5, 24/7 brew house filling large vessels. The bigger British breweries, they didn't operate 24/7, certainly not. They had a brew day. It could be quite a long brew day, but probably from 5 or 6 in the morning through till 7 or 8 at night. And you would have a lot of mash tuns, feeling a lot of coppers, going to lots of different small vessels.
How many? You told me earlier.
Oh, I mean, I think in Brick Lane, the number of vessels, it was certainly, we had 6 big mash tuns, 2 small mash tuns for coloured malts. There were 6 kettles, coppers.
So the coloured malts were mashed separately?
At one time, not in the time I was there, they were big. But that's what their intention was for.
Wow.
And they were fitted with
So
rakes.
everything was separated at one point and then blended in after the boil.
Yep, into multiple smaller vessels. Originally, on one side of the brewery, it would have just gone into the big porter vats, into tons first and then into the porter vats for storage afterwards. But on the ale side, it was comprised of 2 sides to the brewery, but it meant that you could probably brew in a single brew, if you were, because they all started at the same time. You'd be brewing in the region of 3,000 barrels on the Truman site in one day, in one brew.
Wow.
Now, that would be split amongst probably 12 to up to 20 different vessels. at different gravities.
That's all from one mash.
All from one big mash, not from one mash tun. You'd have 6 mash tuns.
Okay.
And we would go along mashing them all at once, and you'd probably be 2 of us mashing, trying to run 3 mash tuns at a time. Certainly 2, sometimes 3.
Makes the brain hurt, doesn't it? The
sounds
non-linear process.
So simple, of course.
And
Right, that's how we started. It's a simple process,
It's a
really.
simple process.
Just get 50 mash tuns and run them all at once.
yeah, that's it. I mean, if a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with the last commercial brewery I was, hopefully Wimbledon's commercial, but the last significant commercial brewery I was working for, Fuller's Brewery, they're probably familiar with their 3 major brands, Fuller's ESB, Fuller's London Pride, and Fuller's Chiswick. Well, they all come out of the same mash tun, effectively. They had 2 mash tuns there. And what you do, you'd have two copper lamps coming off from the mash tun. They would have 2 copper boils, 1 strong one, 1 weaker one. And by blending, for example, 75% of your strong wort with 25% of the weak wort, you had a 1055 gravity beer, ESB. By blending it 50-50, you had a 40 gravity wort, Fuller's London Pride. And then 75% of the weak wort, 25% of the strong wort would give you Chiswick.
Right, which doesn't even come to the States. Yeah.
No, sadly.
yeah.
And it's not that available in the Fuller's estate either. It's not being produced much, sadly.
But and then there's also
Well,
Golden
Golden Pride.
Pride
Yeah,
and
in
Vintage
which case,
Ale.
Golden Pride, which produced the equivalent of this, a barley wine style, vintage ale, at around 8.5% alcohol. That would just be purely the first runnings, the first wort.
Okay, and then you had mentioned before that Truman's had a Burton brewery as well as a London brewery.
Yeah, absolutely.
And was there a reason why some batches were brewed at Burton versus some batches at London? Because I read that you talked about was it a stock ale and a running ale, I believe?
Yeah.
And the stock ale would be brewed at Burton, and then the running ale would be brewed in England. In London, just because it's so simple, as you mentioned before. Why?
That's right.
Yeah.
At the end, we brewed the running beers. Before then, it had all been produced in Burton. But at the end, when we brought down the stock, the rest of the stock ale down, when they closed the Burton brewery, we then had to produce runners to make the barley wine for really the last few batches of the barley wine that came out of the brewery.
Got it. And then why? Oh, so it used to all come out of the Burton brewery.
Yeah,
Okay.
initially. Yeah. And
Okay.
it was bottled up there into small bottles. When it came down, it got bottled into slightly larger bottles.
It got rebottled.
No.
Oh.
When we
yes,
transferred
yes.
the
Okay.
final part
I
of
understand.
production.
I understand.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I just came in right at the tail end.
The end of
but
the era, the end of the Burton era.
Yeah,
You
the
were in
end of
there.
the Burton
Yeah.
era, yeah. But fortunately, when we were discussing this beer and dealing with Ron about the history, and Ron was looking up the brewing records, which came from the Burton brewing books, I was able to talk with one of my colleagues, a very good brewing colleague, a chap called Mike Spillane, and he had actually worked in the Burton brewery. He was very similar to Mike's position. He was their development brewer, and then he moved down to London and became our production director. He had a lot of experience, and he was able to confirm what, for me, was a slightly vague memory. I'm pleased to say that, in essence, it wasn't too far
Which
off.
was brewing on the Union system.
Yeah, and the stocks would have been brewed on the Union system, undoubtedly, yeah,
Wow.
pretty much. I'm sure. Well, I think Mike confirmed that. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So that's. I mean, that alone, I think, is pretty cool. That you yourself, even early on in your career, maybe were brewing on a Union system. But Mike was Mike Spillane, the third Mike that we're talking about.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
I think that-
Lots of Mikes,
Yeah.
including the ones.
And the Burton Union system, I think we figured with Brewery Yard, which is the Burton Stock Pale Ale, that maybe a likely source of Brettanomyces contamination was coming through the Burton Union system.
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
that's
really
what-
impossible to sanitize. And
That's what the head brewer of Marston's told me. That they're a nightmare to get clean, the Union systems.
Yeah.
which you've
The
got a
last
picture
one,
of.
right?
You
Yeah.
got a picture of in the Beer Temple bar.
Yeah, I took the picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the last one, right? That's the last Union system
Yeah.
in operation. Okay. Still in operation, I hope, right?
Yeah, they're still using it.
Good.
Bass ripped out theirs, I think, in mid-1980s, no, early 1980s. So they were still using them till quite late.
Unbelievable. So now we have these beers that you guys have made as part of this series, all from Truman's, all. Well, I guess the Brewery Yard was a non-blended. That would have been like the kind of the very special beer that is aged for a year. It's just the first runnings, I would imagine, heavily hopped. No? Okay. Oh, what was it then?
It's a single guile beer.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, all the worts are
Just
combined into one beer. Though I'd say that though it might have been party guiled with P2, because they often. Because the brewery name of that beer is P1, so Pale Ale number 1, and they also had a weaker one which was called P2, and they quite often party guiled the two together. So I can't remember if this particular one was single guile or party guiled with another pale ale.
Sure, right. And I was thinking, what in my mind I was thinking of would have been single guile, but I guess it's different than just using the first running. Single guile, I'm using air quotes, again, not great for podcast, would be what we think of today, right, Mike and Mike? Not Mike S., you're not here. As like modern kind of brewing technique, right? It's all just
like a linear process. You take a mash through to the, just to do a little English to English conversion. When Derek says copper, if it's not common knowledge, that's what we would call the brew kettle. But through the kettle we hear it all the time, but just a little bit of, and then, all the way, basically a linear process from mash all the way to cooling into the fermenter. So what you're describing just makes my brain hurt a little bit.
Well, if I could just, if you're running a traditional British mash tun, which is a single infusion vessel, really, so and you run it to get probably most of the goods out, so most of the extract that's going to be available from the grain you've got there, you're going to finish up pretty much running it efficiently at about a beer that'll finish up at about 5.5% alcohol. So in effect, if you want to produce beers stronger than that, there's two ways of doing it. You can either boil it for the next 6 hours, which some brewers used to do, to just make it evaporate off and get stronger, or you can take the very first charge from the mash tun, which comes off a lot stronger and would naturally give you an 8.5%, 9% ABV beer if you just fermented that on its own. Typically, maybe up as high as 10. If you're running a big full mash tun, you'll get the first worts will be coming off round about 10.
What types of beers would those have been, where they were just taking those very first runnings?
Well, there would be things like the barley wine. It would be the stock ales. They would be almost exclusive. You might have added a little bit of second or third wort just to adjust the gravity. Within UK, we had to get the gravity quite accurate for the excise because we had to declare the original gravity on the labels. We weren't declaring ABV during this period. We were declaring original gravity, which is how our tax was based at that time. So a lot of these practices stem from the taxation system.
Yeah, that makes that like incredibly confusing, intense blending of all those things makes so much more sense. Because I was sitting here trying to be like, why would you do it this way? And like, oh, you have to get the right gravities for all of these. And if you have a large mash tun or several mash tuns, then that makes it make so much more sense to me. Like, what would be the pressure put on this? Was it just the technology wasn't there? Or, but it seems that it was the tech.
The more you look at this, we're doing it again. I know it's fine. The more you like look into beer history, the more you realize that these styles are almost always political, yeah, for one reason or another.
Well, and Ron, I think that's something that you've concluded is that quote unquote styles have, taxation and other things related to that have so much influence on what we consider to be beer styles.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of beer styles, British beer styles, they've mostly been driven by war. So all the big changes in British brewing all occurred during major wars. So in the case of porter, the Napoleonic Wars, which is when the malt tax was really high and brewers were looking at ways to save money. And it also coincided with the time when they started using hydrometers and they realized that the yield from pale malt was so much better than the yield from brown malt that even though it was more expensive, it was actually cheaper to brew using a base of pale malt. And that's when all British beers go over to a pale malt base. If you look at before 1780, 1770, all British beers were brewed from a single base grain. So it was either pale malt, amber malt, or brown malt. And porter was a 100% brown malt beer. And this change completely transformed British brewing. Diastatic versions of brown and amber malt disappeared, and so the only base malt that was available was pale malt. It was the only malt with enzymes that they had. And then you see World War I and World War II also caused huge changes to British beer, mostly through the form of taxation, but also, especially in the case of World War I, through direct government intervention to say, right, you can only brew beers of this strength. It's mostly, but it's a combination of taxation, which always goes up during war. Beer was always the way they raised their money. For a long time, beer provided a third of all the tax income of the UK. So it was hugely important in terms of tax revenue. And then you've got it also coincides with technological change. So when you see technological advances, that also changes beer. So we were talking yesterday about one of the big things that no one knows about, or is almost completely ignored nowadays, is a thing called an attemperator, which is a way of controlling the temperature of fermenting wort. So you basically have a series of metal tubes inside the fermenter, and you run cold water through it. And it means you can control the temperature. I mean, not to a degree, but you can have a fair degree of control over the temperature. And the introduction of temperators at the end of the 18th century meant that London brewers could brew 12 months of the year, so they no longer had a summer break. So that was of huge importance to porter brewers, because obviously if you can brew the whole year round, you're using your equipment much better. But getting back to party guiling, just to make things more complicated, Truman's also did a thing with some of their stouts where they blended post-fermentation as well.
Yeah.
So not only had they blended pre-fermentation, that after fermentation, they then blended up the beers to get even different ones. That wasn't typical, but it's dead confusing when you see it in the records.
Why did they do that?
I've no idea.
Okay.
And nor have I, because it didn't happen in my day.
So this is like 1880s, 1890s.
But going back to Black Eagle, and starting with Obadiah Pound, it's just blending of aged and fresh beer. Mike, as a fellow brewer, is this something that you do, blending aged and fresh? I know you've got a lot of all Brett beers and a lot of just straight up Saccharomyces beers, but do you take aged beer and blend it with fresh beer?
Very infrequently. We've done it a handful of times when I was at Pipeworks, but it was more just being like, we'll put some barrel aged to get whiskey flavor into things, not to like have like different strains or runnings of the beer. It was more just like, let's see what this tastes like. So it wasn't.
We did the same thing. Yeah, we did the same thing. We wanted to do a kind of a little bit more of a more approachable barrel aged beer series. We did did you ever get the Cooper series? Like we did a porter and a blonde Doppelbock and a Scotch ale, and they were aged 3-4 months in bourbon barrels. So not as big of beers as Bourbon County, but they'd get that 100% that bourbon spirit character, and then we blend them back with fresh beer. So we'd brew a fresh batch of the beer, do basically a 50-50 blend. So you'd get some of the kind of like with this, you get the elements of the aged beer, but then the fresh beer kind of makes it more approachable. What do you guys think of the beer?
Yeah, I think it's time that we talk specifically about this beer. So on paper, I was looking at the numbers of the brewery yard versus the Black Eagle number 1. And they look pretty similar on paper. You've got one that was, I think, brewery yard was 8.4. This one's 8.6. I mean, it was considerably more bitter. It was 62 IBU versus 38. So it's about a third more bitter, but that really doesn't. I mean, they're completely different, and that's why the confusion compounds for me, because they're both, I guess, would they both they could be, I guess, Burton ales, I guess, depending on where they were from. One was all stock ale. One was stock ale blended with running ale is what this most recent Black Eagle is. And the characteristic differences are so stark between the two. They're completely different. And it's like, oh, it's another English old ale, just to use the term. They're so different. I mean, they're night and day. So this beer is what I would consider to be the, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike Shalau, like a classic English barley wine, right? It's like fruity and caramelized and a little bit, it has a nice warmth to it. What's up, Mike? You want to say something?
Oh, just like from my memory, the Brewyards also had the Britannomyces character was much more prominent. Mm-hmm. And then this has the bitterness isn't prominent, but there's a dryness to this that might be in that one, but it wasn't as top of mind when I'm drinking it. This like strikes me as being surprisingly dry.
Yeah, and it's 7.5 Plato finishing gravity.
Yeah, maybe that's my brain being like, oh, barley wines in America finish at 12 Plato.
There's the finishing numbers. I'm handing them to Mike, but it's analytically 38 BU, but 7.5 Plato finishing. So whereas
sweet,
Brewery Yard would have been 1.5.
Yeah, right.
Maybe 1.
But there's just something about this that like is.
But there is a drying element. There's some bitterness there to balance.
Translate that. What that means, the BU to finishing gravity.
We'll get our buddy Ray Daniels in here to talk BUGU, but yeah, it's that balance. I mean, it's even, get a Lagunitas IPA and like that kind of old school character of an IPA with sweetness and caramel malt. But we remember the bitterness wars, the BU wars were massively bitter beers in American craft beer 10, 15 years ago, but they had a lot of sweetness to them. You needed that. If you had a bone dry beer with 90 BUs, it would be hurting the palate. And so Brewery Yard was much drier. It was pale malt and some sugar, right, Ron? I mean, that's pretty much it. Whereas this beer had invert number 3. So again, to translate a little bit, Ron and Derek, give us a little background on invert sugars, because I don't think that's something that an American craft beer audience would know much about.
Invert sugars. Certain British styles of beer, it's virtually impossible to brew them and get them to taste right if you don't use invert sugar. The principal one being dark mild. The first time I tasted number 3 invert sugar when I was with Derek at Fuller's when we were doing one of the Fuller's historic beers, I tasted number 3 and I suddenly realised that was the key flavour of all the dark milds I'd drunk in my life. And it wasn't dark malt like I'd stupidly thought. It was actually number 3 invert that provided the bulk of the flavour for mild ales.
And how is that produced? Because I feel like it dictates how it tastes, right?
Well, in UK, certainly. And I think to some extent the Belgian brewers as well, who are very strong on their use in their Trappist beers, etc., the sugars, candy sugar in particular. But Britain was using a lot of cane sugar, and the cane sugar will be coming in. And cane sugar is largely sucrose, but if you want to make it more accessible for brewing and slightly change the flavour, there's a treatment you can do it by warming it in certain conditions, gently heating it, and slightly changing around, and what they call invert the sugar. So there's
like the actual molecular structure of the sugar changes
a little bit. What it is, it's the way it alters the light, and you put the light through a polarimeter, which will show you the way in which the light is bent.
Cool.
As you pass the light ray through, it's bent. And if you invert the sugar, and what you're actually doing is breaking the sucrose down to its 2 component sugars, fructose and glucose, and it inverts the way in which it bends the light. So if you like a prism, it sort of turns it round. So instead of shining over there through a prism, it shines over there. You can't see that on the radio, I'm sorry. I'm pointing either side of myself.
Maybe you'll get it.
So it bends the light, and depending on what they call a rotation, they can measure the degree of inversion, how much of the sugar has been converted into its component molecule parts.
Was this originally done to increase fermentability?
Quite likely, because Yeast can't actually ferment sucrose. So if you put sucrose into a wort, the yeast will invert it itself first.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
got to invert it.
Got it. So it's like a speeding, probably a speeding of the process.
It speeds it up. That's right. But with number 3 in particular, during that process of inversion, you can heat it for a bit longer, and you will actually caramelize some of the sugar.
Right.
So it's a flavored. It's a flavored.
So it gets darker
I
and
think-
gets a richness of flavour, which is what Ron was referring to, within the sugar itself. So it's not just used for the extract that you're going to get from it; it's the flavour that comes with that extract.
Like the Belgian syrups
Right,
that
totally.
that your audience would be more familiar with if they're a craft brewer. They would know the D180s or whatnot. So invert's typically a 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Is that the scale? Or 1's the lightest, 4 is the darkest. So we used 3 in the stock and 1 in the runner. So the darker one in the stock beer and then 1 in the running beer.
This is a beautiful, like, ambery red color. And
Yeah.
how much of that
Some
comes-
crystal malt as well, but mostly,
Most of that
I mean,
comes from the sugar.
you've got it.
I didn't want to read your recipe.
No, the stock beer is basically 90% Maris Otter, 2 and some change percent Crystal 60, and about 8.5% of Becker's number 3 invert. Actually, Matt Becker from Michigan, who's I think en route here now, not to join us on the podcast, but probably in the bar later, makes British style invert sugar syrups in Michigan. So mostly for
awesome.
craft brewers, but so again. I think the key message being that it's sugar with some character. That it's adding some color, adding some character other than just fermentability.
Yeah, I think I was being tricked. Not that being tricked, but that perception of dryness is more just the not bitterness, but maybe a little bit of that character that happened to that, where I expected the sweetness on the aroma to be pulled through on the palate, and it isn't. It is more of a dark kind of molasses, not molasses-y, but like that kind of caramelized
brown
molasses
sugar and some caramel for sure.
I mean, when you think of it in terms of some of the Trappist ales and their use of dark candy sugar, and then you smell it, I'm like a whole different like set of descriptors is kind of jumping into my head when I smell the beer now that I think about this inverse sugar. Inverse or invert? Invert sugar. And it's and Ron, I can completely see where you're coming from, where you start to think of some of these classic flavor profiles of some of these dark English beers, and I could totally see where this sugar would play a role in that.
I mean, I can see when I taste the dark Belgian Abbey beers, what I immediately think is there's no dark malt in this, that the colour's all from sugar, which I think a lot of people don't realise. And I can remember when, drinking American versions of some Belgian styles, in particular triple, where people had tried to brew them all malt, and they just ended up a complete and utter mess.
Yeah.
Just they hadn't been fermented out far enough.
Because the Belgians tell you, no, we don't use sugar in this.
Yeah, I think that's it. Certainly 10 plus years ago in homebrewing and American craft, that trying to make these Belgian beers all malt, I mean, Goose Island included. I mean, Père Jacques an all malt beer, trying to be somewhere between like a double and a quad, and a great beer in its own right, but it's closer to this than a more drier Westmalle double or something like that.
Yeah, I was once trying to demonstrate to my son how a hydrometer worked. And so what I did, I filled up a tube with some St Bernardus Abt, and I was saying to him, "Oh, you see that this will still be quite a high gravity." And I looked at it; it was like 1,005, and it's like what? And I couldn't believe how low it was.
Because it's 15% sugar, 20% sugar.
But because it's still quite a sweet beer,
Right.
and
Ethanol sweetness too.
yeah, I was just amazed at how low the gravity was.
I think it's also interesting to think about, like, Americans would think, like, there's so much difference between British-built brewing and Belgian brewing and German brewing, and then really everyone was kind of inspired to die by each other, and there's a lot of overlap, particularly, I think, between some of the Belgian beers that I really love and English, like, pale ale and things like that. Like,
I think the inspiration was British brewing.
Totally.
You know, they had the head start, you know,
Right.
with pale malt and steam power and all that. And then we told that story a little bit with Obadiah Poundage, but these things, and that's, I think, part of the message that I want to convey, that Ron has conveyed on the blog so many times, is that we're so, you and I, I'm pointing at Mike Schlau, as American craft brewers and American craft beer drinkers, we're so used to we came onto the scene and tasted these Belgian beers at the period of time when British beer available to us was London Pride and ESB and Sam Smith's Oatmeal Stout. We didn't think of Brettanomyces.
Right.
You know, it was many years later that Brettanomyces, oh, wait a second, why does it mean British fungus?
Right. Well,
And, you know, and then the story starts to unravel as far as like, okay, they were doing, the Belgians were heavily influenced by the British.
right, like so much of the beers. I run a brewery that makes Saison, and a lot of what we do has Brettanomyces added at packaging, and I'm like, we're trying to make it taste like British beers actually taste, is what I figured out like well into this. Tasted in back in the day. I thought we were trying to make it taste like Orval. It's like, no, that's just trying to taste like these British pale ales.
Well, yeah. I remember telling people years ago that I thought Orval was an IPA, and they just laughed at me.
Yeah.
And who was right in the end?
Especially,
Can I just say at this point, though, I spent most of my brewing life trying to keep Brettanomyces
Totally.
out of my beer.
right. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And like all we do, every remake finishes at 0 Play-Doh, so it doesn't. We're not going to blow anything up. But yeah, it's just like finding the overlap in those things, and then realizing like that extends even further than that when you think about like inspiration, or like especially now when you go and taste beers, and then you're like, I'm trying to make my version of that, and then how you like mess it up kind of becomes like the new style, right? The way you can't make it the way that you wanted to make it, it becomes the new thing you make.
And one of the weird things I found out concerning Brettanomyces was when I started looking at East German beer. Oh. And I mean, I know because my wife's from East Germany, so I spent quite a bit of time in Berlin in the mid-1980s. Mm-hmm. And porter was quite a common style. And they were deliberately infecting it with Brettanomyces. Mm-hmm. So this is like in the 1980s. So when British brewers had stopped using Brettanomyces in their porters and stouts years and years before, in East Germany they were still doing it.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And just to reiterate in almost a different way what you were saying, Mike, about how the relationship between English beer and Belgian beer, and just reading some of what you put together, Mike, and thank you for doing that. I saw a reference to, before the use of hops, you really didn't have these keeping beers the same way that you would now, because hops, are a strong antimicrobial. And there was reference to, the brewing season and March and October beers, kind of pre that era when they were having these keeping beers, and or when they could kind of brew kind of later into the season, which of course, it being October now and Oktoberfest, or we drink Märzen, March beer. It was amazing that, all this stuff is so connected together, where the English, obviously hundreds of years ago, did have because there was talk of specific March and October beers, or beers made at the beginning of the brewing season, at the end of the brewing season, which I think is where that tradition comes from.
Yeah, but there's October beer and there's March beer and there's October brewed beer.
Right,
and they're not the same thing.
Right.
And you'll see, right up until late in the 19th century, brewers are advertising that their pale ales are genuine stock pale ales that have been brewed in October, because that was the best season for brewing them. Also, some of the adverts say that the beer, they guarantee the beer to stay good for at least 12 months if the casks aren't opened. Mm. That's completely without refrigeration.
Right. Wow.
Because the beers were just incredibly well brewed, and were designed to be very robust. It's like the beers that were sent to India. If you look at the way they produce Bass Pale Ale, they brewed it, did the first primary fermentation, stuck it into hogsheads, rolled them out and stacked them up in the brewery yard, which is why that's called brewery yard, and left them for a year. Mm-hmm. And then they put them on the ship to India.
Right. Which is, I think, what the brewery yard was a little bit inspired by was the pale ales, that the export stock ales, or is that right, Mike?
Yeah. It was their top level pale ale, so it's the equivalent of Bass Pale Ale. So
that beer is the equivalent of Bass Pale Ale.
Yeah.
Wow. It's amazing.
It was a direct competitor with it.
Yeah. Same as with, the number one barley wine Truman's and number one barley wine Bass. They were Burton breweries that were direct competitors. So again, we didn't call out the brand on this, but Brewery Yard is in essence Bass Pale Ale, circa 1877.
Amazing. That is mind blowing. That is Bass Pale Ale, circa.
Which is why Ron's theory of why Orval was basically trying to be Bass Pale Ale makes sense, because Orval came online as a brewery.
Absolutely.
In 1920s as a brewery, not as a monastery, but as a brewery, when the most popular beer in the world was
Bass Pale
Ale.
And I know for certain that Bass Pale Ale contained Brettanomyces in the 1930s, because someone there's this weird book written by a Dutch guy about Brettanomyces that was published about 2 days before the Germans invaded in 1940. And he'd had analyses done of various Bass beers, and the IPA had one type of Brettanomyces in it, and their stout had two types.
Wow. That's amazing. That's so cool. I mean, it's really mind-blowing. I think we probably covered it, but I just wanted to go through it one more time. So it's Black Eagle, number one barley wine, two different words, and the number one referring to the strength in almost this like fictional line of beers. If there was a whole line of Black Eagle beers, the number 2, the number 3, the number 4, they would be becoming progressively weaker beers from alcohol by ABV, right?
Yeah.
Is that generally how the number goes?
So I mean,
it's not a stylistic thing. It's a alcohol content thing.
Well, it's stylistic as well. So the lower numbers, so the numbers like 6, 7, and 8, they'd be mild ales. So they would be quite different to number 1 and number 2.
But it could be a pale mild or a dark mild, right?
Depends what period you're talking about. And,
that's the problem with history. And the beauty of history is there's always context that needs to be provided.
If you're talking about the 1870s, then all milds were pale.
Okay.
Dark mild only starts appearing 1880s, 1890s.
Okay, and that was because that's when invert sugar was discovered, or what's that?
We were discussing this the other day, but it's probably more likely as a semi-replacement for the porters of the day, which were dropping out, and there was still
basically a beer to put the slops in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you needed something dark.
Okay. So when milds were pale, what was the difference between a mild, and we're getting a little off topic, but what was the difference between a mild and like an ordinary bitter when milds were pale?
The difference would be the hopping rate.
And the aging, really.
Well, no, if you run about an ordinary bitter, that's a running beer. So that would be sold young as well. But if you're on about a stock pale ale, well, the difference would be that the mild would be really young and the pale ale would be a year old.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you're saying pale ale because pale ale and bitter are synonyms, right? They mean the same thing historically.
Pale ale, IPA. But IPA and pale ale, they are used completely randomly by British brewers in the past. And you cannot pin down any differences between them. And the way I normally go is it's what the brewery called it.
Did they call it bitter? Did they call it pale?
Or did they call it IPA or did they call it pale?
Yeah.
Breweries virtually never called their beers bitter.
No. It's a mild,
internally in the breweries, they were almost always called pale ale. It's only in the pub that people called them bitter.
And the brewery marketeers of their day. I mean, it was a marketing term.
Yeah.
So they took the pale ales and they said, right, it's now, they're calling it bitter.
Yeah.
And that became a popular term. Of recent, it's dropped right out. You won't find many bitters in England anymore.
Even Fuller's.
No.
You see a full 4-pack of Fuller's bottles here in the U.S. It says, what do we say, amber ale.
Amber ale, it's a really annoying term.
So they've scrubbed it out even in England.
So,
sadly.
Ironically, in the days where we've had IPAs
it's becoming popular,
known for their bitterness. So.
I mean, what you also have in London, you had pale IPAs, which were always weaker than the brewery's pale ale, and ended up being like under 4%. So say Whitbread, they introduced their IPA in, I think just before 1900. The pale ale they'd been brewing since the 1860s. The pale ale was a classic pale ale gravity, 1065. When they introduced their IPA, it was 1050. And then they dropped it down to 1045, even before World War One.
So has that cleared everything up for you now, Mike Siegel? You got it now? Yeah.
and that style of low-gravity IPA, a really good example of it is the Harvey's beer, which is, I think, only about 3%, their IPA, 3.5%. And that's in that tradition of low-gravity IPAs.
Got it. So the story of IPAs were stronger pale ales brewed for the foreign market is just, I don't know, just a fairy tale, essentially.
No.
That was the original.
Well,
Okay.
well, when you say strong.
Stronger.
Yeah,
maybe.
no, in the 1870s, I was on about Bass's range of, I think, 1 to 7 they had. The two lowest gravity beers that they produced were the number 7 and the pale ale. They were both 1065. So the Bass's IPA was actually joint lowest gravity beer that they produced. It wasn't the lowest in terms of ABV because it was fermented out so far. And I've seen analysis of Bass Pale Ale that were 1,002 FG. So it got up to almost 8% alcohol sometimes. But that was only because it was really, really fermented out. And if you look at if you go back to, say, the 1830s or the 1840s, a London brewed X ale, so their weakest mild ale, would have
An X ale, so a single X.
yeah,
Okay.
would have a higher gravity than their pale ale or an IPA. And it's only the fact that the pale ales tended to stay the same strength through the 19th century and the mild ales tended to drop.
Yeah, I'm just, my head is
It's a lot to-
spinning.
it's a lot to
It's spinning.
collect, yeah.
And I was also trying to think of like people listening right now must just like their heads must just be absolutely spinning. But I think one of the interesting things to remember is it's always been shifting. It's always been changing, a lot of this stuff. And there's always been this interrelation in a lot of the brewing cultures, I think, between, the big European brewing cultures, which I would say mainly were the Germans and the English, and then, the Belgians as well, as kind of, I think, stylistically, we think of as very significant nowadays. But I think from massive industrial terms, I don't think the Belgians were really, they were just,
No, Belgian brewing was really old-fashioned. When you see foreign brewers who go and visit Belgian breweries in the late 19th century, they're just horrified. They think that they're dreadful. Oh, Sedlmeier went to Brussels in the 1830s or 40s, and he just totally hated Lambic. He just thought it was the worst beer ever brewed.
Gabriel?
Yeah.
Yeah, from Spaten, Munich.
Okay.
He just thought it was just, how can people drink this stuff? Mm-hmm. But we run about the cross-fertilizing of different brewing cultures. There's an awful lot between British and American brewing going on right from 1800 right up until the present day. And it varies which way the information's going. But there's been a lot of interaction.
When has the information gone from America to England? I thought it was always
1890s bottling technology.
Ah.
And you had all these British brewers go out because they wanted to learn how to produce non-sediment bottled beers.
Got it. Was that like Anheuser-Busch when they were kind of
I don't know
doing the bottling? Or
there's a good thing, I think, from the Journal of the Institute of Brewing from around 1890s or 1900s, where you'd had these British brewers go out and to the States and look at what was happening in the brewing industry there. And they were mostly interested in bottling techniques because they were in advance of the ones in the UK at the moment, where you'd only really got bottle-conditioned beers. They hadn't really found ways to produce completely clear, stable beers in the UK, bottle beers. So they were very interested in the American technology. And these are great reports because they're sort of describing what they see in these breweries, but because they're technical brewers, they actually understand what they're seeing. And the other good thing is, because they're outsiders, they're discussing in detail things that American brewers might not have bothered discussing because it was just what everyone did. And so it's things
Right.
where you don't bother necessarily writing it down in detail because everyone knows how you do this. And so when someone from outside comes in, then they start to look at it more analytically. And it's just wonderful, this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, the other one I'd say about going the other way is IPA. And the case of that is that you see, IPA was a really common style for the American ale brewers to produce in the 19th century. But I mean, IPA didn't exist at the time of American independence, or at least wasn't called IPA. So that must have been picked up at some point after American independence, probably in reaction to beers like Bass. I mean, I don't know when the first IPAs were brewed in the US. I mean, that would be really interesting to find out. My guess would be probably 1840s, 1850s. But who knows? You'd have to start looking through America.
And it would have been in the style of Bass. It would have been in the style of Bass.
Yes, I deliberately try not to get sidetracked with things like this because I know I can go down a rabbit hole and then that'll be 6 months gone.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, thank you guys for coming here and just talking about English brewing history and this specifically these barley wines, these English strong ales. Mike Siegel, is there anything that we failed to touch on that you think would be interesting to mention before we get out of here?
Where you can buy it.
Oh, right, that part. See, it's funny. Derek was asking. He's like, "So, do you just like highlight different beers that you have in your shop each week?" And I was like, "We're not really that good at being, a business."
He loses his capitalist edge every now and again.
Exactly.
This is being sold just at our tap room, draft in 500 milliliter bottles, starting tomorrow, October 4th. So we're doing a little release event at the brewery tomorrow night. We're going to talk about the beer. It's going to go on sale. So if you're interested in tasting a beer like this, come to the Goose Island tap room.
Oh boy, he's putting the pressure on to get this episode out really fast.
No, not for the release, release event,
okay.
but just if you're interested in tasting the beer, the one place you can be able to find it is the Goose Island tap room.
Sadly, we're too late to tell people that the only place you're going to be able to drink the individual beers that were blended together is at the event tomorrow.
I saved a keg of each of the running and keeping beers, so we're going to taste that tomorrow for educational purposes.
I may have already planned to have been there tomorrow, so see. So good. Maybe I'll be seeing you guys again shortly.
But thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited, and I really want to try these. We'll do this off air, but we'll try the Obadiah Poundage and the Brewery Yard. Ron and Derek, thank you guys so much. Mike Siegel, I should say, thank you so much for setting this whole thing up and just really, and just I know that this is a passion project for you, that it wasn't an unintentional series, but to me, it is one of the coolest series of beer, or just see, these are some of the coolest beers being made in America that I am aware of. They are really just special, and I'm glad that someone like you has taken the time and the effort to research this, to reach out to experts like Derek and Ron, and to recreate these things to the best of your ability, which when you start reading into what they've done for these beers, it is above and beyond what you would think is reasonable to make it authentic. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so true.
Yeah, there's special beers. I think whenever my I don't know if I'll get to 54 years, Derek, but whenever my time is up in brewing, I know I'll look back at these beers amongst the fondest of all the beers that I've ever had a part in being a little part of. But yeah, all the beers they taste unique. The experience is fun and challenging and rewarding. So I love it.
Awesome. I love it too. Well, thank you guys. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone who listened this week. And you'll hear from us next week for more of The Beer Temple. So long until then. Oh, I messed it up. I always do.
Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard, seen from again. Remember, this is what we wanted. Remember, this is what we said. To never be heard, seen from again. again, 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 again. Remember this is what we wanted. Remember this is what we said. To never be heard or seen from again, 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 again.